everyone, welcome to our 5th anniversary stream. Today my guest will be Miles Tost, our senior level designer.
That's hard to say, isn't it?
Yeah, that was hard.
It's a long title. Yes, hello.
Yeah, thank you. We will be playing Blood and Wine today. We have Sebastian off screen playing the game for us, and the quest that we are doing today is the quest which name is in French, I think. So I'm sorry if I mess it up.
The one thing harder to say than my title.
La Cache au Fou. I hope it wasn't too bad. But basically, this is the quest with the spoons. So we'll see where it takes us. You were the one to choose this quest, so maybe you can tell us why did you choose this one specifically?
Yes, it's a very narcissistic reason, because it's a quest I got to work on together with the fantastic Pavel Sasko. Some of you may know him, and I think an environment artist for us was a guy called Marcin Michalski, who unfortunately doesn't work for us anymore. He went making indie games, I think. But yeah, he got to work with us on this awesome location, make the Trastamara mansion and all that, and I think it is quite the fine quest, if I may say so myself.
Of course, that's completely fine. Okay, so before we get to those beautiful locations, we have to go meet Regis. So before, let's talk, how long have you been here in CDPR? That's quite a while, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's been, I think in January it will be 10 years.
Wow.
Which is a bit of a problem for me, because we do this awesome, like, 10 years, here you get a little present, you get a little showing, all that, and that's also cool. But for me, technically, if it's in January, it means I have to like another whole year till a Christmas party. We'll have to do. But yeah, it's been a while.
Wow, so how was it before? Because you joined for, was it The Witcher 2 or was it The Witcher 3 already?
Witcher 3. I basically joined the team right as we hit production, if I believe correctly. So I remember the day I joined, where basically everyone was pretty much on edge in the studio. Not because of my arrival. I like to think. Don't know. But there were two things going on. Like the day after, I think, we launched the Cyberpunk reveal cinematic.
Oh,
so that was exciting. But it was also, I think, internally we were first showing the game to journalists, like the very first sort of vertical slice of Witcher 3. So a lot of that was going on, and I remember a lot of that was still built like on Witcher 2 assets, some of the models imported over, and it looked much more like Witcher 2 than it, of course, in the final product ended up looking like.
Okay, so I think that was a busy time to join the company.
Yes, it was pretty great though, because I was one of the first level designers, and so the studio also didn't really have like a grasp of level designers. What do we even do with these, right? And like there was one other guy who was a level designer when I joined, and he later went on to become our master of destruction and tech artist team. So he basically handles all the destruction work, so I remember the first few days it was more like, they set me in there and go like, oh, here's our game world, please plan it.
So they were like, so what do the level designers do? What do we need them for?
Exactly, it was like, okay, I guess Skellige, forest here, mountain there, and then there will be a ruin there. And I basically just spent like the first few days just literally mapping out the entirety of Skellige, which was pretty crazy, considering that I started out as an intern and I was like right in the middle of it.
Wow, okay, so what do level designers do?
We create chaos for other teams. But a person much more intelligent and wiser than myself once taught me this sort of definition, which I think is really close to my heart. The idea being that level designers create playgrounds that allow players to express themselves using the systems of a game. Oh. And I think it's quite nice, because oftentimes when people think about level design, they think about good-looking locations, right? And just making the stage of the screenplay, essentially, for, that you get to play around in. But I think level design is much more than that. It's taking into account the game systems, all the gameplay stuff, right? The combat, the way you move, does it have stealth, the quest sequences and dialogues and all that. And it's trying to create locations that cater to this and support these systems, right, to make them stand out and sing better.
Oh, I see. We have Pavel Sasko grave here.
Speaking of, that's where he is. I've been wondering where he was all around all
Is
day.
he in the chat or?
Yeah, people just told me he was in home office, but
Oh well. But he's not the only one, right?
no,
we have more people here.
It's actually one thing.
Oh, Marcin Przybyłowicz.
This is probably how you pronounce the name. Actually, it's supposed to. But yeah, it's like a macabre joke we have is that all of the graves in Blood and Wine reference developers who worked on the game, and this is not just on this graveyard, but it's also on the run immediately outside of Beauclair, where I think I myself may be lying around as well. I'm not sure. So yeah, you can try to go through all of these and try to match them and send us all the screenshots of where we lie.
Yeah. Yeah, try to find as many people as possible. I also know Amelia for sure is there. You know her as a community manager here. So you will definitely be able to find her and a lot of other people. So we'll see about that. Okay, but when we have like this kind of graveyard, did you have your hand in doing anything about it, like creating it?
I'm actually don't quite remember. I think there was some tweaking and some designing I was doing here, but I think the bulk work of the location here may have been done, and I might be wrong with that, by fantastically talented environment artists these days. He used to be a QA, which is, I think this was Kuba Wichnowski. I'm not entirely sure. Might be wrong once again, but we have a team of many very, very talented designers, but also artists, quite a few of whom also sort of are QA, who sort of graduated and became developers, as the projects went on. And an expansion like this is a fantastic sort of opportunity to give, people from inside the studio who want to basically take a shot at development, a stage and an opportunity to actually make content there. So actually, if I remember correctly, there were quite a few people who, we hired and who knew or were switching jobs internally, having their hand in this expansion. And I think that's just such a cool thing of expansions.
Yeah, but I think it just basically on Projekt. Some people, start as a QA. Like a lot of people call it like the stepping stone to game dev. So your entry level job, and then they decide on what path they want to follow.
Yeah, it happens often, and I'm quite proud to say that I think at CD Projekt Red we seem to be like really strong with that. We have a really strong internal QA team, which is not common, I guess, in the industry to have such a force of embedded quality analysts and assurance testers. But the other thing also is that shouldn't be forgotten is, of course, that it's really difficult to get great QA, right? And it is a stepping stone. And I myself, started out in QA during my studies. I was doing like a side gig of a tester at a third-party testing company, and for many, it is like a cool way to get into the job, because usually when QA is embedded within another team, so you have like a gameplay QA guy, you have a narrative QA who works with these respective teams, they get to pick up a lot of the knowledge from the respective departments they're set in, allowing them to make that jump eventually, right? But it's not to be underestimated how valuable and incredible it is to have really good testers and also analysts, which is sort of slightly different, because the way these guys play games is remarkable. It's really important for us to have this, bouncing back, seeing the big picture, right? Because I, as a developer, might be looking at my slice of the game that I create, and these guys, they play it all, right? So they can tell me, the idea that works well in this scenario is cool for that, but in the grand scheme of the game, it doesn't make sense, like, yeah, you need to do this with the door and open it in that specific way, but you never do it anywhere else in the game, so how am I supposed to understand it as a player, right? Like, if that is, and it's that is an immense value, right?
Of course, like good QA is very valuable for the company. So you started as a QA, but in CDPR, your first job was junior intern level designer, right? do you need some specific education, some specific skills to become a level designer? What do you need to learn to start?
A part of me would like to say like, yes, it's of course like super complicated. You need like a Harvard degree in level design making. But the reality is, I think, and this goes for most jobs in the industry, that it's quite accessible in the sense that it does not require a special education. Because in by itself, the industry is still relatively young, right? So we can,
definitely.
you know, like these things like game universities is only just kind of happening nowadays. It's getting more and more popular. But even in our company, we have lots of people, even in the level design team, so it's everywhere essentially, that sort of came from entirely different industries as a background, right? And made their jump into the game industry through a variety of different ways. And, you know, each one of these has like a super fascinating story that, you know, like, so I know one of my colleagues, he used to be, for example, a plumber before, you know, he started working as a level designer. And now another person who was a butcher. Then we used to have someone who was a lawyer. Other developers I know, and especially for level design, it's kind of cool. We have, I think, 2 people with an architectural background who used to be architects, and that for level design is really, really useful. Yeah. And also like a constant source of knowledge for the rest of the team, right? Because we can sort of draw on their experiences as architects to make our level blockouts better. So the one thing I always kind of tell people then when they try to break in the industry is mostly that it's not so much about where you come from, but like what you do to get into the industry. And mostly that is in the case of level designs, right? There's so many opportunities and chances these days to start making something on your own. You can pick any of the various mod kits for games or level builders, right? That you know, allow you to build stuff. Skyrim's creation engine comes to mind, for example, right? Or you can take any of the engines that are out there, Unreal, for example, and start building a level there. There are so many resources out on the internet that can get you started. Varying degrees of quality. There is some sifting that you need to do, but you know, like you can. It was never easier to get into contact with other developers, right? So I try to maintain a relatively open channel to, you know, like to new talent, trying to help them out, and as such, equipped with all of these possibilities, it's entirely possible for someone to start building their levels, right? Start making stuff, building a portfolio, getting feedback from other, you know, beginners and also even devs, and that way slowly break their way into the industry.
Yeah, I think that happens pretty often. We have some modders on our team, people who were starting as modding the game, The Witcher 2 or The Witcher 3, and then we saw it and like, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think last week Philip was on the stream, right? Or the week before.
2 weeks ago.
And he used to start modding for Witcher 2, right? And that granted him not only the job, but also a sword, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, probably. Okay, so basically we have some already some questions from the chat, but guys, if you want to ask something, feel free to write the question in the chat and we might answer that. But before we go for the questions, we have a joke.
What?
We have a joke from
No. I'm from Germany. We don't do jokes.
No.
Okay,
Yeah, a friend of mine got kidnapped by a group of mimes. They did unspeakable things to him.
I get it, because mimes, they don't speak, right? And so when you say unspeakable, you refer, okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, if you have to explain it like that, it doesn't really work, but thank you for that.
I think it works even better. You're welcome.
Anyway, yeah, that was the first question, a very, very important thing that we had to talk about. But also a small reminder that we are not announcing anything on this stream. We're just talking about game dev stuff, about the game itself, about how it is to work here. So please don't expect any announcements or reveals here. But back to the... just wanted to lay it out there because
managing expectations.
The questions are already in the chat. I know it. But yeah, let's see. Do you see a difference between designing a level and designing a whole open world?
Yes, one is bigger, but not necessarily more complicated, right? I think people often mistake that the scale of the level necessarily correlates to how difficult it is to make it. And while to a degree that is true, things become really strange if you follow that definition and thought of Naughty Dog's games versus, like the big other open world games that sort of exist, right? Both of them are really hard to make, just for very different reasons. And so when talking about our games, I'd like to generally differentiate between two kinds of level design. One is, much more micro in the sense that it works on the specific locations for the quests. For example, here when we look at the screen, we have this, this gravesite, and so on the microscope level, there's like someone who needs to design the location according to the requirements for the quest, the gameplay, and all that stuff, right? And it's this specific instance of the game, this graveyard, the mansion that we'll get to later. These follow their own kind of rules. And then there's the other kind, which is a bit more high level design work, where you basically plan the world, right? You figure out how does the player move from one location to the other, how do they stumble upon these locations, how are these locations placed in relation to each other, what is the density of this. You answer all of these kind of questions to make sure that the experience that the player has in the open world is as smooth as possible. And this actually is something that we improved in Blood and Wine over the base game quite drastically, is the way how these locations chain together, right? So oftentimes in a cave, for example, in Blood and Wine, you'll have a situation where they will have like one entrance and one exit. And this results in the reason we did this is, of course, to minimize backtracking, but also what usually happens is once you exit the cave from the other side, you'll get the next potential target visible on the horizon already, right? So you leave the cave, you see that castle on a hill in the distance, tempting you to come explore it. And doing it is like a way of allowing the player to constantly have this call of adventure, right?
This
And
is cool.
it's, yeah.
I mean, speaking of level design, I know that often when I play the games, I see like clearly, okay, I know that they want me to go this way. So do we use this kind of tricks in our games, or how do they look like? Sometimes it's very like clear. You basically have an arrow pointing you somewhere, or like a specific color telling you, okay, this is where you're supposed to go. What do we use? Do we use something?
Yeah, I mean, we have various methods there, and it really kind of depends on the vision of game that you're trying to build, right? Because a lot of people give games flack who are too obvious.
Yeah.
I think it's a context thing, right? Sometimes you play a game where it's not so much about the difficulty of puzzles and all that stuff, and more about the ride and just the experience and the, just being immersed in it. Then it's cool to provide a lot of outs for the player and hints and all that tell them where to go in more or less subtle ways. And we utilize these level design techniques as well, right? For that we have methods like using the lighting to make certain areas of a level stand out more than others, to guide the player's attention and eye to where they need to be, right? Because we want to convey specific information, right? We want to tell the player where they should go, what they should do, and all of these things, right? So they know. Whether they go and do it is their choice. But it's really a matter of planting the thought, that when you see the exit, it's fine, you can go roam around and loot it. But the reality is that even in these scenarios, that is already a success, right? Even if the player doesn't commit to it, because it gives the player the information, okay, this is where the quest continues, this is where I can continue. So you feel more comfortable actually taking the time to explore whatever other area.
So you already know where to go to like finish the quest, and you can...
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's almost nothing worse for me in when I play a game and I think that I have a grasp of where it continues and when it continues, and I want to go and explore, and then I go and it triggers a cutscene, and then actually it continues, and I'm like, wait, but I thought...
Yeah, I know the same. I know when you don't know which way is the main story, but you still want to roam around, and you go the wrong way, the main story way, and you cannot go back. That sucks.
Yes. And that's something where if it happens, you can probably blame the level designer for it happening.
Okay.
And it's not good, but it happens.
Yeah. So when you play a game, obviously we know you stream, and you also talk about level design a lot on your streams. So what's your like type of playing? Do you just go main story, or do you focus on like what I call it licking the walls? So basically, basically going into every corner, checking stuff out.
That's such a great way of operating. Wow, you don't want to do that in Cyberpunk though. Like the walls are very dirty.
Oh yeah, Witcher, there can be some weird stuff too.
It's probably more so the latter. I think when I'm in my streams, it's a bit difficult because the focus is on sort of exposing how difficult but also awesome the work of developers is on the game. So it tends to be that even in games where I think they're relatively short and I go like, yeah, we can totally crush them in like 2 or 3 streams, we never finish them because usually we spend like an hour just in the first 10 minutes looking, you know, at certain aspects. And it's really, really cool to see in different games how developers tackle essentially the same problems that you know all kind of developers have, but they all find different methods and cool ways of doing it, sometimes similar ways, right? And it's really, really interesting for me also to see that what works in one game doesn't necessarily work in another game, right? And my goal with that is a bit to, because it's very easy for developers to get flack from well, people in the community, like for why can't you just make it like this and all of that stuff, right? And that's easy for one part of the community to say that, but it's also easy for the developer then to turn around and go, you idiots, why don't you know this? Right? You know, my job is hard and all that stuff. And the reality is, frankly, that how can the people from the community really know this when developers do like a really bad job actually at being transparent about how the magic works, right? And just never unlifting the veil. And part of why I think, for example, what Pavel does is really, really awesome, right? Because it is exactly shining the spotlight on the difficulty of this and how each and every decision we make as developers usually has like this huge trail of conversations leading up to it, right? And nothing ever almost happens by accident in video game development. Everything is thought through like 20 times over, and you can't do this because this would happen otherwise and this would happen otherwise, so you choose the lesser evil, you know, to kind of
just like
be
girls.
in this situation. Yes, that's the life of a developer. It's difficult. And yeah, so I think it's important for developers to shine a light on that and kind of show everyone, hey, you know, this is complicated, but it's great and awesome process, and you know, get everyone on board and share that passion.
So from what you are talking about, it seems like there is, I mean, it doesn't seem it is like that. There is a lot of cooperation in between teams. So which teams do you cooperate with the most, and what the process? Basically, what's first? Like, do you first get a quest script or the environment or the level, or where does it start?
Yeah, I mostly drink coffee and troll people on Twitter and then tell people, I try to push people to do awesome shit and complain about things. That's sort of how my...
That's very Polish. You're accommodating to our country.
Very much, very much. It speaks to me on a different level. But no, usually this has kind of changed over the course of the years that I've been here. How it used to be much more is that at the very beginning, and in that way, it's kind of cool that, you know, having been here for as long as I have, it's kind of like watching this crazy coming of age story with the studio. At the beginning, our process was relatively rowdy, you know, it was pretty wild, pretty chaotic, pretty free form, but it resulted in lots of people sort of being able to add their ideas, test things out, right? And yeah, we had a bit of a problem with feature creep during Witcher 3's development, right? Because everyone was kind of trying to sneak in some cool things, but it is part of the reason why you find all of these little cool details scattered across the world, right? Because it's usually come from a place of not trying to sabotage our project, but usually wanting to make things really cool and better than good, right? And so we would do this cooperation in level design, for example, where either the quest, we'd have both scenarios really, where the quest designers would come over and go like, hey, I have my quest here, we need these kind of locations, what can you give us? And we'd be like, this part of the quest sounds like it could be in a cave. I have just the right cave lying around here. And we'd pick it and adapt it to what was going on, right? But we also have the other scenario, which nowadays is a bit less likely to happen, where level designers or location artists would have created some stuff, you know, as planning the world, because it's something we do, you know, like, hey, you know, there's so many bricks in this world. Somewhere these bricks should come from. So let's make a brick maker's village somewhere, right? And these things would start existing, and then we pitch these to the quest designers, you know, to help us add content for these. And you know, I think over the years our process has developed quite a bit. As the company grew, we cleaned up our process a bit more, right? And these processes kept changing, but I think at some point we may have gone even a little bit overboard with like cleaning that up. So like the individuals might have not been able to contribute as much as they used to. And you know, for a short, brief moment, we may have lost, like, I guess, a bit of a sense of what made us so successful to begin with, which is sort of like our you know, insane focus on delivering super high quality stuff, right? And the cool thing is, for me, that, and I think this is something that might not be obvious to many of our fans out there these days, but when we create new content, we have pretty much, you know, changed our style of development into a way that's quite a bit more efficient, I must say, but also lets people again contribute on a you know, from all kinds of angles. That's and this brings me back to the beginning of the question. Can do this loop, where, you know, speaking of the departments, I don't think I've ever worked closer with our sound designers, our cinematic designers, quest designers, environment artists, gameplay designers, and even QA, you know, like to make the stuff that we're making as good as it can be. And I'm really quite happy that the way we've sort of shifted our development style in recent times has resulted in like a much more efficient, collaborative, creative, and most importantly to me, because of that, fun way of developing.
That's the most important part of the job, I guess.
Right?
Awesome. So maybe it's time for a few questions from the chat, because I see we're getting some. The question from Kinley is, Miles, what is your favorite piece of environmental storytelling in The Witcher 3? And why is it the two towers in that Skellige Valley?
First off, hey Kinley, nice to see you around. Secondly, favorite piece of environmental storytelling. I think, I'm not sure if it is my favorite, but one that comes to my mind is that we had, at some point when you're trying to save Dandelion, as always,
He gets in
there's
trouble.
this moment where you break into, is it gnomes or dwarves, who have this counterfeit painting workshop in a basement.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun, you know, sort of coming up with ways to make, like, okay, these gnomes, they're not very tall, but like they're trying to use the height of the entire sort of basement for them. So they came up with all kinds of contraptions and sort of little scaffolding that allows them to create these gigantic paintings and basically counterfeits of existing paintings in the world. And I know that was like a lot of fun to just kind of make, also like, you know, taking the paint buckets that we have, just kind of spewing them everywhere. Generally speaking, that is sort of on the small scale, but what I am, I think, particularly proud of when it comes to Witcher 3's visual storytelling is not so much what happens just on the smallest level of detail, but rather how the world itself has been constructed in a way that it in by itself makes sense, right? You could take Geralt out of the equation, and I think you could still have the sense that the world would exist and work in its way, right? So while it is not up to the scale that it might need to be, if you look at the city of Novigrad, you have the infrastructure needed to believably and plausibly keep this place running, right?
This is a real city.
There's lots of agriculture around it to feed the people in the city, right? The way the city is laid out makes sense for it, right? You have the areas where they do the tanning, the leather works and all that outside of the walls, because that would smell bad usually, right? Again, as I said, the Brickmakers is one of my favorite examples because they are not only a little homage to Witcher 1, south in the swamps, but if you look at that location in particular, you see not only that, yeah, somewhere the bricks that Novigrad is built with, it comes from somewhere, but you have the process of it being made, then you have a big main road connected to the shoreline there, where there's like a little ferry space, that in this ferry space, or ferry harbor, that's where they load the bricks up and transport them to the north, right, to Novigrad. But also there's a main road connected all the way from this brickmakers village in the far south of the world all the way to the north. So you can have like this, if you really want to look for it, sense of there being a believable infrastructure at some point before the war broke out in this section, right?
Wow, that's a really cool example.
Yeah. And I think that's something we took a lot of care of, right? Like whenever we would build something, we'd always ask the question first, why would it be here? You know, usually the way people build villages is they don't just randomly place it in real life, right? They don't just randomly found a village at any random spot, but there's usually something that warrants that village being where it is.
Yeah.
And however, on the other side, when you make games, sometimes you have to force that and go, okay, but we need this village to be exactly here because of the main quest story and blah, blah, blah. You know, we need it to be in the mountain because of this. And then you have to think, okay, these guys live in a mountain, which is really a shitty place for people to build a village.
Yeah.
That's really harsh, right? So why would they do this? And we usually try to give them a really good reason, like maybe they're miners and they mine for gold here, and this important resource has resulted in them facing the harsh conditions of this area and kind of building their...
Yeah, it has to be believable for
Yeah.
them to be in such a place.
And that's something that we always try to kind of consider with our stuff, and I think that's the visual storytelling that you know I'm really proud of.
Okay, so let me ask you about another thing. There are a lot of differences between Blood and Wine and the base Witcher game, including level design. So could you like talk about it? Was it challenging to work on it? What did you like more, The Witcher 3 or Blood and Wine?
Yes, that's a loaded question. Yes, of course, it was very challenging. All of game dev is really complicated, and but in another way, it's like a very different thing to make an expansion versus the base game, right? Because if you start making the base game, it's kind of like opening Witcher 3's map for the first time, right? You have so many question marks. And you know, you just look and go like, oh my god, where do I even start?
Yeah.
Right? And then you kind of, you know, like at the end of the development of like a base game, you have explored most of these question marks. You know the answers, you know what's behind them, right? Like all the development questions, like how does the game work? What can the player do? All of that.
Yeah.
You have answered this. The game has launched usually, right? People have played it. You get feedback, what worked, what doesn't, you know. And you can take all of that knowledge and move it into the creation of the expansion. And that makes expansions for me particularly fun to make, because no longer are you know, trying to answer the big sort of question as to how the game has to be made. No longer do the tools that we have need to be developed in order to make the game.
Yeah.
But you have all that in place, and it's pure creative, you know, creation process.
You can get crazy.
Exactly, and that's usually why expansions, not just for us, tend to have the more sort of like crazy ideas and all that, because you know, like you free yourself from a lot of sort of baggage that you need to answer in a base game. And so that makes development between these two very, very different, right? And also for me personally, a lot more fun, because it allows people to really just focus on making cool stuff, trying to use what they learned, you know, and to make better scenarios, improve and iterate on existing ideas and all that. And I think Blood and Wine is a great example of this, where, you know, and this is sort of why this question, which one do you like better, is very difficult, because I think the open world of Blood and Wine, generally speaking, is sort of the pinnacle of the Witcher 3 sort of, you know, like universe, open world creation, and is in many ways improved over the base game's open world experience. And same goes for, you know, the way we do cinematics, cutscenes, and all of that stuff. All of that is, you know, much cooler in Blood and Wine, because, you know, we sort of improved our skills and used our experience to improve that from a level design perspective, a couple of things that we tried to bring in as we were creating new locations there was, for example, the rule of having multiple exits for locations, or more smartly looping our locations back to the main entrance, right? So that you wouldn't have this backtracking experience. Trastamara Mansion is a great example of this because it also has a second exit, you know, at the very end when you defeat or battle the Spoon White. Spoilers.
It's 7 years after release.
Yeah, and you see like the way that we then chain these points of interest together and all that. That's something that's improved. The general navigation we tried to improve in Blood and Wine when it comes to sort of how intuitive it is to move through the world. So Beauclair has exits in many directions of this city to allow the player to, you know, like not have this scenario where, okay, you want to go right to the east, but the way you would do that is by going all the way to the west and then
that
around
wouldn't
that,
make
right?
sense.
And we eliminated a lot of that to make the experience in by itself much smoother. And then there's like tiny small tweaks that I'm not sure people really noticed, but they are important to us, right? For example, I remember going through the fast travel points and setting up that first shot that when you spawn in and you would not move the camera at all, that first opening shot usually is much more picturesque because it's more deliberately chosen than the ones in the rest of the game. So in the rest of the game, you kind of look at, you know, like at a tree right in front of you as the fast travel pot. Here in Blood and Wine, it most often is that you're greeted with this amazing vista, right? So because the fast travel point was rotated in just the way that when the player spawns, you know, it gets.
So
this
that's a very small detail, but I think it gives something special to the game.
Yeah, I think, you know, like, hey, you get the picture, postcard picture moment all the time.
Okay, so this is the mansion that you designed. Can you tell us something spicy, maybe some secrets that it holds?
Yeah, I remember when I was pitched this idea, the idea of a Spoon White was really odd to me. And it's like, Miles, it's spoons. It's spoons everywhere. And you're like, oh, okay. And it really took me a while of getting this explanation of how the spoons fit in. Yeah, right, it's spoons. And, you know, the stroke of genius really is to tie this whole thing to the, you know, the Gaunter or Dim sort of line.
I know. And he with the spoon.
Yeah, and I think this really tells us, like, is how we do our weaving and storytelling, right? It's like we come up with crazy ideas, but all of these need to be grounded and believable within the context of the world. And suddenly a crazy idea like, yeah, it's a monster who collects spoons, you know, which may be from mythology. I'm not entirely sure. Some of the stuff we do is, some of the stuff is sort of like more original. But sort of tying that into like our existing sort of narrative and universe makes all of it better, right? It doesn't just make the quest better, but it makes the other part of the, you know, like the Hearts of Stone stuff essentially better, and it's really nice. And yeah, I remember basically working on this, and I think when we already started working on this, we were kind of sure that this should be like a horror-esque kind of experience, right? We don't go like, you know, fucking Amnesia levels of, you know, like horror with our quest, but we make spooky stuff, I suppose. And that was kind of something we knew before, so that's why we have lots of these longer corridors in there, right? Where it's a bit more claustrophobic and you can't see too far and around the corner. Lots of places where it feels like you could be ambushed, little nooks and crannies, right? And of course, this freaky moment where you sit at the table with the Spoon White itself, right? And I think this is one of the really cool things about being Geralt as a monster hunter, is that you don't just, you know, plan to execute the monster to begin with, but sometimes you have these scenarios where you get really uncomfortably close to them, right? And instead of fighting them outright, you're forced to, well, have a dinner with the monster, right?
That's
and it's
weird.
like it's pretty strange. But it's I think that's sort of what makes, you know, the monster hunting experience when Geralt does it really unique and really fascinating from a player's perspective also.
So you just put spoons everywhere in this location?
Pretty much. It's spoons everywhere. And like I remember one of the cool I'm not sure if that was planned from the very beginning because it's been a while since then, right? We were making this in 2015.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm not sure. I just have this moment in my head that I remember it was really, really cool when I first heard the wind chime sounds from the spoon. So they, it's not just spoons, right? And just random spoons lying around, but this monster does something with it, and it becomes decoration, something else, and the wind chimes add to the spooky atmosphere and all that, right? And coming up with all of these ideas is a very fun creative process, right? And these kind of moments that we have here are even in the Witcher game relatively rare, right? Because either you arrive usually a bit too late, the monster has already killed everything, right? Or you it's outright, it's the griffin, you need to go kill the griffin, right? Or whatever. And here, you don't really have even this human interaction with the monster because it's still this monster, but it's this really bizarre in-between space, and I think, you even get to make the choice there.
Oof, we picked the right one. I mean, the good one, I guess.
Also intriguing, I think this got to be the only instance where as a player, we actually have to hide somewhere dedicated, or one of the few moments.
Yeah.
And one thing that for me always is interesting, and that's something we'll be talking about with the QA stuff, right? Unique instances like these can be really treacherous because they're cool as places when they are created, for the quest itself, and you only play the quest and it makes sense.
As a standalone.
Yeah, but if the player has never learned that hiding in a closet, right, is ever a thing in any part of the game, then it's kind of difficult to get the player to do that, right?
You probably need to have a very clear prompt to tell you that now hide.
Yeah, and that's sort of what we need to in our situation. Then we need to be a bit more on the nose with these kind of situations, right? Whereas, for example, think about Amnesia or the Alien games, right? You see a closet, you instantly know, okay, I can hide in there, and that's something that you do. The game doesn't need to prompt or to explain that to you in the later stage at all. But we need to work on this much, much stronger, right? So you can, use your Witcher senses to see the closet. It's highlighted, right? You go close to it. It has a prompt on it that says hide and all that. It's very in the know. Geralt says, I guess I need to hide in there in the closet, right? And it's there's a lot of help that you get to do this. But if on one end you can say, this is a bit obvious, right? But on the other end, it's needed because of the context of that you work with. And it's always something that as developers you need to kind of acknowledge and also be conscious of.
So this is the only time in the game where you actually need to hide? That you remember of?
I think the one that I remember, there might be another instance or so, but I'm sure that some of this happens in for example, when you meet the ice giant for the first time, you don't actually, Geralt hides on cutscene, right? He kind of hides away. It's not you actually hiding, because it's not really a mechanic that we have in our game, right? And
Stealthy Witcher.
Stealthy Witcher, right? But
it's not very often seen.
But sometimes, for these narrative experiences, it's cool to kind of create these scenarios, right? So it's always sort of finding the balance of creating the new and the unexpected and trying to create a variety while at the same time keeping in mind how the player might react to it.
So you said that you wanted to have a horror theme in this location, and this is actually a question from Quelv. Were you ever at this point where you looked at it and oh no, it's too scary, we have to dial down, or maybe oh no, it's too normal, let's dial up?
I think it's rather the opposite side, because we're not in the business of making horror to begin with. I think for us the bigger problem is kind of to make sure that it's still spooky enough, right? And I would almost wager that it is probably harder to make something too creepy than not creepy enough when you want it to be creepy. And it's the same thing when it comes to generally designing a quest or a location or gameplay. Puzzle mechanics are a great example of this, because developers tend to overestimate how good players are, or how maybe that's the wrong way of wording it, but rather how obvious things are by us, right, or from us. So I myself have found myself in this situation very often. I know lots of designers that constantly fall into this trap where you think, okay, I've made everything in this puzzle so super obvious and it's so easy to solve now, and then you give it to the first player to test it and they're like, I don't get it. Right? And it's very easy for a developer to then go and develop this false sense of pride, like, oh, you're an idiot, like, oh, I don't want to. And here it's really a case of when you create puzzles, it's really hard to make something too easy, which is not intuitive, right? It's you think it's more easy to accidentally result in a puzzle that's way too easy to solve, right?
Okay,
But the practical reality is that that's much more rarely the case, and I don't think I've ever experienced a situation where a developer has accidentally made something too easy, but I've experienced 1,000 cases where a developer has accidentally made things too hard, right? And that usually is then a problem, because while challenge is a good thing, if something is just too hard in a game where you don't want it to be like this, unless you're like a Souls game player, usually that can lead to a lot of frustration, right? And this kind of frustration, the worst case, when it cannot be solved by the player, can result in the player stopping playing. And this is particularly difficult for us because we tell stories, and for us it's really, really bad when the player opts out of a story because like they can't solve a puzzle. It's like
something's too hard.
So it's a catastrophe, really, right? Like so we'd rather then err on the side of making the puzzle easier in order to let the story be experienced, which is really where our focus is, like where our strong suit is, right? And then you look at other developers like From Software, of whom I'm a huge fan, and their focus is on the other side, right? So they rather like the struggle, the frustration that you have also from fighting, it's part of the game. You overcome that, and that's when you feel great, right? And it's awesome experience, as tough as it can be. And it just kind of goes to show that in game development in general, there's no silver bullet, right? And everything is like the methods that you apply to the design of your game is highly contextual to what kind of game you're trying to make. And which makes game development so incredibly fascinating for me, because on my streams I also talk a lot about, these are techniques that designers do and all that, but you can't take these and apply them to every game and assume that they just work like that, right? And in some games, I was actually talking to this with one of our junior level designers just earlier today. Actually, I can talk about it. We had like a situation where you need to climb something. Huge spoiler.
Oh wow!
And there were some shrubs on that thing, right? And I told her essentially that these shrubs make it so that the player doesn't want to climb there, even though we want the player to climb there. But in another game, these shrubs would be the place where you'd climb, right?
I just wanted to say that you sometimes climb the shrubs on the walls
where you have
something.
mechanics, right? Like, so they can be a visual tell by a level designer to show, ooh, there is some shrubbery and that's where I need to climb. In other games, it's, that's the place you can't climb, and you need to look for the place without the, shrubbery to kind of climb there. And it's, this kind of stuff is fun, right? It's really interesting to figure out what is the medicine, the working design for your game, giving the context that you have, and which is why it's always also difficult to kind of, go into the internet and read these silver bullet solutions, by people go like, it works in this one game, why don't they just do it in that game, right? And like also do it.
Well, okay. So you've been talking about puzzles a little while before. Any favorite puzzles you created for our games? Maybe The Witcher, maybe Cyberpunk?
Yeah, see, that's a bit of a difficult one because we don't really do create a lot of very complicated puzzles, right? I think in Witcher our puzzles don't really go further than Igni, this weird rock, and then the door opens. It's, usually much more simple than that. And if we do have it, then it's heavily guided, right, through narration. Geralt, looks at like has the Witcher senses, the clues that guide him to the solution. And again, this is because of how we focus and prioritize our experience. So when I say like we made a cool puzzle, I feel it's always like you then look at games that dedicate their time to puzzle, like I don't know, the Zelda series, right? And it's like, okay, that's a puzzle, right? I once, like actually I can give a little development anecdote about this rather, as opposed to, so sorry, I'm not gonna totally go for a puzzle here, but I was one of the people responsible for sort of creating the locations for the treasure hunts in Witcher 3. Basically, the major locations for this, one of them being the Lynx dungeon, where you get it's under Novigrad, right? This elven ruin where you get the beginning. That's the whole thing with the corrupted Witcher Kirin, that and you get the cat armor thing right there and all that. And originally, I wanted this to be like a much more complicated puzzle section, right, where you'd go in and it'd be almost like a little reference to one of my favorite games of all time, which is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And I wanted to have this segment where some wraiths would pop up, and essentially they'd sort of go to one corridor on the left and one to the right, and the player was meant to kind of follow that and, defeat each wraith, which when they'd come back out of their respective wing would result in like a flame popping up and you hopefully getting the note that, yeah, okay, I killed the wraith, it did a thing, the fire turned on, there's a second fire, probably I killed other wraith, like that was the sort of thing. Reality is, when we were playtesting this kind of stuff, people didn't get it. Even though it was basically implemented exactly how I kind of described it.
You thought it was so easy.
I thought it was mega easy, right? Nintendo did it. Like they did it, do stuff for people so that you can solve it. Even you have no tutorial problems. They're masters of this kind of stuff. And I thought, haha, if we just do a similar idea, it's got to work. But again, context, and we kind of figured, okay, this is not going to work. So what we did, and it broke my heart at the time, but now being a more senior developer, looking back at it, I fully understand it. We replaced it with a golem that's just roaming in the middle, right? So you kill the really strong golem and then you can basically pass through. But it just goes to show how, once again, the context of the game really matters when you and also, you kind of have to ask yourself if when people play a Witcher game, is it really a game where you want to spend a lot of time solving complicated puzzles, or is it more about like, I want to see what this story develops into and all that stuff, right?
But would you ever want to create such a puzzle? I mean, I know some games, and sometimes they can be annoying when trying to solve those puzzles. But then when you actually solve it, you are so happy that you actually managed to do this.
Hell yeah, I love to do this. I mean, sometimes we afford ourselves the luxury these days to kind of add these little things in. More so lately, I think, to those of you who've been diving into our Cyberpunk patches that we've been moving out, the whole Nibbles thing, for example, right? Like these little things. We've been doing some secrets and cryptic stuff there, right? And on the occasion, like in Cyberpunk, there's, for example, one. This is a totally blood and wine topic. There's during the parade, there's a little puzzle, which again kind of shows how far we want to take these, or maybe not brave enough, maybe we should be more brave, I don't know, you tell us. But like there's a moment where you can break into, like there's a little side room where there's some grated door, and behind it there's some treasure, like a iconic legendary weapon that you can get. And so the idea is there's a little puzzle hidden there. It's not telegraphed, right, but it's meant to allow the player to find the code for a terminal that, if inserted, the code will open the door and you can get the loot. Something we do nowhere else in the game, and as a result, players don't really look for it, right? However, because of this, what we also decided is to simply put a very difficult skill check on the door to also allow other players to kind of break in, right?
To open it.
And now it's up for debate whether this is the right way of doing it, and as a designer, we have a lot of back and forth discussions about this, whether it's cool to do it, whether it should be more, non-linear in the sense that you take this option out to easily break it open and only keep this, so it's just a reward for those people who look really, really closely, which I personally am a big fan of. But you sort of have these debates, right? And it's not always clear, like the Witcher universe, right? It's always black and white, you know, it's not black and white, it's shades of gray, right? Things are, like with design, there's not often like the clear sort of, this is the way to design thing or not. And even to this day, we're sort of still refining our processes, we're having these conversations. And I guess though, with, you know, how positively, I would say, these little secrets have been sort of taken. And you know, there's still some out there, guys. It's cool to get that sort of positive feedback for it, right? For us.
Nice. Okay, so you basically told us to just roam around. So why did you do that? What can you tell us about Tucson?
It could be a trap though, because like I, as a level designer, you must also understand, have the interest of you just roaming around everywhere, right? So maybe there's nothing, but I just want you to take a look at all the awesome stuff we made. I mean, you tell me.
Are you like, there is a monster hidden somewhere, right?
There's, I mean, it's a Witcher world. If you want to.
Okay, so I saw that Sebastian actually took fast travel to get here.
Yes.
And I've heard you several times like talking about fast travel. Like if you fast travel, there's a level designer that dies somewhere in the world.
Yes, yes. I have a very strong opinion.
What's the opinion?
I joke around a lot saying that if you fast travel somewhere, someplace in the world, a level designer dies. So don't fast travel. And this is, of course, a very biased sort of view on fast travel. However, I do have a bit of a reasoning for it, right? Not only do we level designers and also the environment artists, because it's like two disciplines who are kind of responsible for making the locations in the world, spend a lot of time of making all these cool places. And I honestly think there is a lot of, you know, value in just doing what we're seeing on screen, just kind of roaming around, taking in the world and sort of pretending a bit like you're actually Geralt wandering, right? But a Witcher is on the path after all, right? What's the Witcher without the path? But on the other hand, you know, I do think that fast travel, as much of a convenience as it is, I think a good amount of players, how do I formulate this? A good amount of players sort of use it because it's a bit too convenient, right? And they would otherwise not use it if the game was designed in a way that would encourage them to be in the world more, right? And one method how we try to do this in Witcher 3, for example, is have roads be something where Roach has infinite stamina on, right? So it encourages movement between locations in a non-fast travel way. Whereas on other games, such as Red Dead Redemption, they do it with a cool cinematic camera and all that stuff, right? To allow you to fast travel in between places. And usually, oftentimes, for players that is well received, right? That isn't to mean that I'm generally an enemy of the fast travel mechanic as a whole. I think, you know, when you have very little time to play and you just want to get from place to place, it is a cool tool to do that. But I think there's probably methods and things we can do, as we've done started doing in Witcher 3, where you can sort of discourage players from doing it, you know, or rather different. Encourage them to rather not do it because of, you know, the world, how awesome it is, how the stuff that you can stumble into. And if you think about it, that really is what happens, right? If you fast travel, it is usually with the intent of cutting out the fluff in between it, right?
Much stuff along the way.
Exactly, you miss out on the opportunity of kind of stumbling into stuff, right? And there's an experience thing here and like a design discussion that can be had for hours on. Yeah, I'm glad to have it.
So when you play a game, do you fast travel?
Only usually, like when I have to show something specific.
Okay.
Like because, you know, like it depends. If I play for myself, I usually actually do not fast travel because I'm kind of considered part of the journey, usually, like the experience. And I do like to get lost and sort of sidetrack from one thing to the other and kind of also you know, just sort of experience that call of adventure when it does call, right? However, I have fast traveled in the past. I will say this. So there may be a level designer or two, potentially more, that are on my death note essentially.
No level designers were hurt during this stream.
Not during this. Wait, we did fast travel. God.
Just once.
How shit would it be if I went back to the studio now and one of our juniors kind of just collapsed, and it'd be your fault?
Oh no. Okay. So we already finished the quest, but I think we can roam around a little bit more because we have a couple more questions. A very important question is basically you play the game, and obviously it's also kind of like a research for you. You look at some stuff that other developers did, and you probably take some inspirations. But do you have some other sources of inspiration other than games?
Yeah. You know, since we work on open world games, the cool thing is that I doubt that, lady. There's like a lot of aspects in real life that we can take inspiration from, right? Be it because of, you know, like the roaming experience we have here, but sort of like because the way we do our content, the quests and all that, they're filled with a variety of different, you know, like stories and that draw inspiration from various aspects of real life, right? And I know that, you know, film is a big one for us, and also on that note, it really also depends on the discipline you talk to, right? Our cinematic designers might draw from film much more strongly, for example, than maybe our quest designers who may be more inspired by, I'm just making this up now, like for books or so, right? I'm sure a quest designer will immediately correct me like, no, it's not just books, it's also films and whatever.
Okay,
right?
no, but as a level designer, let's say, real life, is it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's like a lot of the solutions that we apply, you know, when it comes to player guidance, is also kind of rooted in how things are done in real life. And it's also great because we can kind of come up with super gamey solutions, and then we usually have a way of pointing at a real life scenario and go, it's done like this, right? So heavy signage usage, for example, where you know, you have like the yellow stripe on the ground leading you to this specific section of the level, and you go like, oh, well, how cheap is it? They just did like a literal line that leads me to where it is. Well, there are hospitals in the world that utilize this, or airports, right, that have stuff on the ground where you just kind of follow that. And so that's cool when it comes to, for example, what we've done with Cyberpunk, right? Here, it's always kind of cool to find situations in real life where we notice how things stand out, right? For example, if you look at this gate right in front of us, right, you see all the flowers there and all that. That would be, if you saw that in real life, it would be something that even if it was on a wall, it immediately sprang to mind. You're like, wow, these are cool flowers and all that, right?
Yeah, let's take a picture.
Yeah, exactly. Like we do that a lot. Like, and it's no fun to go. It's no fun to go exploring in the real world with exploring in the real world is how I call it because I'm such a nerd. With other environment artists and level designers because you just stop and take pictures of the ground and, you know, just like, oh, look at this rock. Remember
that's a nice grass.
My buddy Mark would stop when we went to San Francisco for GDC. He'd stop at every fucking hydrant and take a picture, and like because all of them look different. It was like very, very cool. Anyway, so these flowers they pop out, right? And I, as a level designer, look at that and go like, wow, these flowers, they really, really caught my attention. Is there a way we can use that in a game, for example, right? And then I look at our gates that we're building and I'm thinking, okay, so I want the player to go through this gate, maybe adding these very colorful flowers when there's no other colorful flowers around, and there were others around, you know, this is just an example, is a way of us to highlight this content, make it stand out more, make it more obvious, right? And this is sort of the kind of interesting thing between the video game and real life. Where in real life, we kind of sometimes have rules to design, like making these stuff, architectural rules and all that, but it's much more free form. I, as a level designer, look at the real world and then kind of see how can I make this stuff and use it to create rules in the game world that the player understands, but that don't feel like video game rules. So, for example, what should be, I'm not sure how consistently we managed to pull it off, but what should happen in Beauclair is that or in Tucson rather, that we were trying to solve a problem of telegraphing to the player which doors lead to accessible interiors and which don't, right? And we tried to do this from a distance, you know, so that you wouldn't have this where you run up to a door and be like, yeah, okay, there's not accessible, fuck. So you go to the next one, right? So what we tried to do is that we would try to reserve the white painted doors for doors that would lead to accessible interiors, versus just the wooden doors to kind of keep them, you know, like these on the right shouldn't be accessible interior. Please, please, please. Ha! But there you go. You know, to kind of create.
So how about this on the left?
Oh God! But to kind of create this
wooden but white.
Create this sort of fuck yeah, what? To create this sort of subtle rule set, and it's not something that we actively point out to the player, like, hey, know this and learn about this, right? But it's something that, you know, like, subtly can be.
I think subconsciously maybe they will find out about it.
Yeah, and these white doors, they just pop a bit more, right? When you look around, you'd rather notice these and be rather tempted to go to these doors then, and the you know, wooden colored ones are more subtle oftentimes and kind of blend into the background. Although, admittedly, from, you know, to criticize ourselves a bit, we do have this struggle of executing stuff like this consistently due to the sheer scope of our games, right? The amount of doors in Witcher 3 in total is insane. Like I think I counted them once because someone on Twitter challenged me once.
Yeah, there was actually like this meme going on. Is there more wheels or doors in the world? So
I don't know if it's
I mean it's about real world, but in The Witcher.
In The Witcher, I think we have more than 3,000, definitely more than 2,500 doors. Interactive doors in the game. That's a lot of doors. And you know, the fun thing is, like, there's a bit of a meme that I think Fabian sort of kickstarted. One of you know, awesome members of the community team, PR rather. I think. Yeah, my bad. And so it is about my connection to doors, right? When really I only place them. I don't really do much with doors, but like sort of people associate myself with doors much more closely than you should. However, I can't help but also notice that inadvertently, somehow I end up talking about doors very often. So
there is a connection.
Yeah, there must be some grain of truth. The reality, though, being that doors are probably some of the most complex, and it sounds like a joke, but it really is the truth, some of the most complicated logical elements in a video game, because they need to work in so many different ways and scenarios, right? Like in one moment, from an NPC sort of logic, right? In one moment, they need to be a wall. So people, you know, when it's locked, people acknowledge that they can't just walk through it. In another, that wall doesn't exist anymore, and the NPC now needs to understand that they can walk through it, right? And it's like, and this can dynamically change it when the game runs. Like something can cause the door to be locked, right, while the NPC is standing next to it, and then suddenly he needs to understand that no longer this is
go there.
And this causes a huge, you know, like problem for AI scripting and all of that stuff, something every developer everywhere in the world, in every studio, like, we're afraid of doors, to the point of where, if I recall correctly, there's some games that actually just don't feature them, right? Because I remember Assassin's Creed, like...
No doors?
Yeah, some Assassin's Creed games definitely, the older ones, they just don't have doors because, you know, like, doors are fucking hardcore. And I remember when we were shipping Witcher 3 or making it, we fucking thought it was mega brilliant that Geralt would push the door when you'd kind of, you know, like kind of...
So you don't even have to push any buttons.
Yeah, just like Geralt just walks through and he puts his hand on it, you know, and pushes it, which is like technological marvel at the time. But, you know, developers look at it and go like, holy shit, what the fuck is going on?
How did they manage
and players are like, they don't even notice it.
Thank you for coming to our TED Talk about doors. It was amazing.
I feel so, how did this happen?
Okay, so we always end up with doors. So let me just, two more questions. Let me ask you two more questions. First question is minimap. How do you feel about it? Like, you put so much effort into designing level, telling players where to go just through level design, and then they have everything on a map or a mini map. Like, what's the connection?
You need to be careful here, because I personally, I have very strong feelings about it. Yeah, it's again, drawing on this line, sort of what kind of experience we're trying to create and for whom you're trying to create this kind of experience, right? And for us, it's really important as a studio that puts storytelling and, our stories in the foreground and trying to otherwise create a smooth experience for players to experience these stories, to put in place the mechanisms and tools that let this story shine. And having a mini-map in our games is one of these, approaches for us to make the exploration experience, and sort of like you get the clues marked on the minimap as well and everything, to give the player a really easy way of understanding when they're doing the right thing, right? And minimaps, as much flag as I think they like to have. If you really think about it, they provide information that other systems really can't, right? So if you look at the minimap, you can, get a good lay of the land around you from a perspective that you as a player don't have. You can understand the shape of the surroundings around you, right? Like you can stand in front of a building, but the building ends without being able to look behind it because you can look at the minimap, right? And that's valuable information, whether you are consciously realize it or not as you explore the game world. However, I do personally think it's a problem that, it can create this sort of over-reliance on the minimap, whereas players will spend most of the time looking at the top right corner of the screen as opposed to the beautiful world that's created on top of them. To which I say, we always in our games add the possibility for anyone to disable the minimap, right? And usually, genuinely speaking, I think Witcher 3 probably is more easily played without minimap than Cyberpunk.
It's less complicated, I guess.
Yeah, because you have this ability of far sight that in Cyberpunk's city jungle of Night City you can't really see far ahead because there's a huge skyscraper in front of you, right? But here, if you turned off the minimap, you could still kind of find your way around simply by looking at the landmarks around you and all that. So you can see how the style of the game has an effect on whether minimap or not also, should be implemented. So, yeah, it's difficult, complicated topic. I personally, recommend anyone to try to turn off the minimap and just see and experience how that alters your exploration experience. If you don't like it, turn it back on, right? But it's interesting to just experience, maybe even for a brief moment, how it changes the way you look at the game world, and to see how these elements, which you really don't spend a lot of time thinking about usually when you play.
Let's see, Sebastian is hiding the minimap.
Oh, it's proof we can do it, right? And how that, look at it now, for me, even now, as I was talking about it, I constantly kept looking at the minimap.
Yeah, that's actually true. Now I look at this corner and there's nothing there.
Yeah, it feels so
I
empty.
can focus on the view.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation, really, how such a seemingly small minimap can actually have a huge impact on the game experience. And funnily enough, they're also not fun to make. Like minimaps are also one of these things that are much more complicated to make than you think and you'd like them to be. I remember both in Witcher 3 and in Cyberpunk, creating our minimaps has been like a really, really complicated, probably more so complicated than it should be kind of process. And there's a lot of logic that runs behind them that kind of makes it difficult, right? For Cyberpunk, for example, we took a long time to zoom out the minimap when you get into the car. People kind of gave us flack for this, right? But the reality also is that there were some really complicated technical reasons for why we had to kind of postpone that, right? Because the way the minimap is rendered, it renders the world in so-called tiles that take the texture, just very simply speaking, right? And the further you zoom it out, the more tiles need to be loaded at the same time, which kind of, just needs to go somewhere in the hardware, right? So, that just means that you need to kind of make these performance gains somewhere else before you can just mindlessly just zoom out, right? And potentially, if you don't do it, melt existing hardware.
Oh my God.
These are the considerations that we need to make constantly, right? And it's stuff that when it comes to game making, as I said, I don't just say that to make ourselves look better by going like, your video game is super complicated. Look at us, how we're tackling these complicated topics. But it's in video game development, it really perhaps sadly, I don't know if it, is the case that everything you see is much more complicated than it might seem. Perhaps for the better, because it would mean otherwise I wouldn't have a job
Yeah,
probably.
everyone
Because
could
then,
just do it.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So thank you. We started with the minimap and went into into the entire
complicated.
rant. Yeah. So last question, and you don't. You just have to answer one word. Tris or Yen?
Oh no, the question. Dividing. It's Shani.
No, no. Come on. This is like the diplomatic answer.
How is that diplomatic? If I'm faced with one evil or another, I'd rather not choose at all. Okay.
We just
I'm
heard.
getting a hint. I think Triss. But I also will say I have a very personal connection to Triss because I was very involved in making locations for her quest line in Witcher 3. So, well, but also kind of for Yennefer. But like, so the location that one of the Triss quests take place in, oh god, what was the name in the game? Vegelbud Estate. The development name was Dawn Estate, so that's how I usually still refer to it. Used to start out as a relatively small kind of mansion. And throughout development, it just kind of kept growing. And the whole Triss thing wasn't originally meant to happen there. But it was kind of just added onto it later when they saw, oh, we have this cool mansion. Like, can we have a labyrinth? And we added the maze and all that stuff, right? So it's one of these locations where, and the stuff that I work on has this sort of tendency for it to happen, where I do like place a thing that's like somewhat small and just keeps growing and growing. People latch onto it, they add ideas and all that stuff, and it just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we added the horse racing, and suddenly this is a huge quest hub, essentially. So, yeah. Triss.
Okay, the answer is Triss. Now you know, guys. I think we will finish on that. You don't have to, write to Miles hate messages on Twitter.
I was forced to this. I have a different answer. You heard it.
Okay, so thank you, Miles, for joining me today. It was a really, really great talk. And thank you, guys, for watching with us. And see you next week. Next week, we are going to stream Gwent, the Witcher card game.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. See ya.